your model. What do you think happened? Now I'll give you three possibilities here. Was it a family of bears, a thief, or the wind? Now, it sounds a little funny, but we'll get into that. The third step of the basic scientific method is you're gathering your evidence or your information that you're going to use to see what best explains this information. So now let's say we find a few things. One thing you find that your strong box has been strong-armed into. Go ahead for the next one. Another thing that you find is you've had some neighbors report that recently there's a family of bears being seen kind of coming around your house. Go to the next slide. Also, you've installed camera system and you saw a person trying to get into some windows and a door. Go ahead to the next slide. And another thing is on the news in the last week, they've been saying what strong winds you have. Okay, there's some information. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So now, based on the evidence or the information we have, what is the best explanation? What is the best cause? Now, we have three possibilities, and I'm not going to go into. You can come up with your own conclusions. However, one of the final steps is you come to a conclusion. Based on the evidence, what best explains the facts that we gathered? Now, this same process, you can use on the cause of the universe. And also, there's tests for truth to determine which does best explain the evidence. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay. We're going to start with, I'm going to start with some evidence gained from cosmology. You can advance to the next slide. Now, one of the most amazing discoveries in all of science was the discovering of how the universe began. And part of this was what was found actually points to what the properties are of the cause of the universe. So let's go through the steps. We have a problem or an observation. We exist. This universe exists. If it exists, there's two possibilities. Either there was a personal, intelligent agent involved, or there was not. Those are mutually exclusive. Either there wasn't intelligence involved or there was not. Those are our two options. That's our problem. Now we come to our hypothesis or model. You can see on the screen different worldview belief systems have given their hypothesis, their theories. For atheists, at first, the consensus of atheism and in science was that the universe didn't have a beginning and didn't require a cause. Different belief systems had different perspectives on what they thought the cause was and what properties of it. Go ahead and advance to the next slide. But here's what we found. What you see here is, you see this slide, it's divided in two halves. Now, let's say that that blue line going right down the middle is the boundary of space and time, when everything began. Because what science has found is that there was a beginning of all that's in the universe and time. All the evidence we have supports that there's a beginning, and there is no evidence supporting that there was not a beginning, that the universe is eternal. When all the evidence is on one side and no evidence is on the other side, even a graduate from Ohio State can figure out what that means. I had to take a shot back. Ohio State's been too brutal to me over the years. Now, if we had that beginning, then everything that's on the right side of that screen, that's where all of time began and progressed from there. That's where all matter, energy, and all of space, every natural thing that is in the universe began and then started going from there. Now, if everything began from that boundary on that right side of the screen, what does that tell you about the cause? If all of nature began here on the right side of the screen and all of time, then whatever led to that, whatever was the cause of that beginning of all nature, can't be natural. It has to be outside of nature, because nature hadn't been created yet. So one thing we know about the cause of the universe is it is outside or beyond all that is natural, all of nature. A second thing we know is if that's where time began at that boundary, then we know the cause of the universe is not subject to time. They are outside of or beyond time. Now, philosophers and scientists have always recognized the need for, and it's been debated, but they've recognized the need for an uncaused first cause. Because you can't have what they call infinite regressive causes. At some point, you need an uncaused first cause not subject to time. And that's what we find as a property of the cause of the universe. A third thing is, based on the second law of thermodynamics, you have the universe began with a certain amount of energy to do work over time, or a certain amount of power, and a certain amount of order. And as time goes on, that power gets used. That usable energy gets used and the order decreases. That's entropy. Now, if it's always decreasing, then that beginning point where the universe first began is where it had the absolute most power. What that means about the cause is greater than its effect. So the cause has greater power and potential for order than the universe put into some of the power of the universe put together. Also, you've heard of the law of conservation of matter and energy. Matter is not created nor destroyed, but yet all of the matter and energy were created from nothing at that beginning. So whatever the cause was, it can operate outside the natural laws. And then finally, there's the last thing is a cause has to be sufficient to explain the evidence we'll find. And we're going to get into that in just a minute. Now, look at those properties. Outside of all nature, outside of time, more powerful than the universe, all the power in the universe. When you're outside of all of nature, that's supernatural. When you're outside or not subject to time and you can be an uncaused first cause, that's eternal. Greater power than the entire universe put together, to me that fits nicely with almighty. And acting outside of natural laws, miracle working, a supernatural, eternal, miracle-working, almighty cause. What does that sound like to you? Now, some people might say, oh, you're begging the question. You're just making, you find some science things and you then applied it to what the Bible said. But it's not begging the question. These properties of the first cause were predicted by the Bible thousands of years ago, thousands of years before modern science figured out the same. And the scientists involved, they recognize this. And these are coming from atheist and agnostic scientists. Nobel Prize winners Penzias and Wilson stated, the best data we have concerning the Big Bang are exactly what I would have predicted had I had nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. Certainly there was something to set it all off. I can't think of a better theory of the origin of the universe than to match Genesis. Contemporary of Einstein, Arthur Eddington, stated, the beginning seems to present insuperable difficulties unless we agree to look at it frankly as supernatural. And then finally, Robert Jastrow, he headed NASA's Goddard Space Institute of Space Studies. He said, astronomers now find that they have painted themselves into a corner because they have proven by their own methods that the world began abruptly as an act of creation to which you can trace the seeds of every star, every planet, every living thing in the cosmos and on Earth, and they have found that this all happened as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover. There are what I or anyone would call supernatural forces at work, I think now is a scientifically proven fact. These are what the people directly involved have said that aren't coming from Christian bias. And that last one, sufficient to explain things. For example, the predictions of a book thousands of years that were clear, specific, multiple predictions. I could give you a dozen that the Bible predicted before modern science found it. If you don't think there's something beyond man behind the Bible, then we should have a lot of other man-made books that are comparable. So if you can think of some, let me know. I haven't had anyone rise to that challenge yet. Also, there's fine-tuning. We're not even going to get into the fine-tuning because we have too much biology to get into. But the fine-tuning evidence also has to be explained either by a personal agent involved or not at all, just nature. And then finally, I had on that slide, etc. That little abbreviation covers a whole lot of area because there's multiple fields of study that are providing evidence for the cause of the universe. And now we're going to dive into one of those ones, very big ones, with biology. So I would like to start with, let me get to my notes here, with Jonathan and with Jean. Are they there? Okay. Jean, I wanted to start with you. as just a question, I know you're a Christian now, and based on you've written a lot of studies and everything, was there ever a time where you doubted that life was created by a personal agent?
I briefly doubted it in school simply because all my education taught me that no, things just evolved. There was no God involved. It just sort of happened. And that didn't make a lot of sense, but there were still moments where those voices were so loud, I kind of wondered. And there was one experience I had when I was in 10th grade, I think, and I was outdoors on a beautiful day, laying on my belly in the grass and looking at a dandelion. And I thought about how I, as a human being, can create things. But I looked at that dandelion and there was so much detail. It was beautiful and it was complex and it was amazing. And I thought, you know what? There's no way this happened by accident. This is design that's far beyond anything I could ever make. I know that there was a maker for it. So really looking at nature, the main thing that showed me there had to be a God.
And you are definitely not alone in that, but that's a very good explanation. Jonathan, now, Jean just mentioned one of the things that just grabbed her attention as far as the beauty and the complexity that she saw in nature. And like she said, beyond anything that even she could create with a whole lot of intelligence behind her. So Jonathan, what are some key things that you think need to be explained as far as origin of life?
Sure. Well, the key thing that needs to be explained that is the hurdle at which all material origin of life models fail at is the origins of biological information. DNA and RNA, life's hereditary molecules, are chock full of digitally encoded information. The RNA, which many scientists think RNA was the first information-bearing polymer, contains information in the form of chemical subunits, which are represented with the alphabetic characters A, C, G, and U. U being uracil, which is in DNA you have thymine instead of uracil, and in DNA the information which runs along the sugar phosphate backbone of the DNA molecule is performing a lot of jobs within the cell. And one of the key jobs that needs to be performed is specifying the information necessary for producing proteins. Proteins are formed from amino acid subunits, and these amino acid subunits, the sequential arrangement of those amino acids, determines how a protein collapses into its three-dimensional structure. And so one of the key things that needs to be explained when we're dealing with the origins of life is the origins of that information necessary for encoding proteins, necessary for self-replication of the first RNA polymers, for example. And that information requires, I think, intelligent agency to bring about. There's only one type of cause or one category of explanation in all realms of experience which is known to produce information, whether it's in the form of a hieroglyphic inscription or a blueprint or the paragraphs in the pages of a book. That cause is intelligent design or rational, conscious, deliberative agency. And so when we find information intrinsic to life's hereditary molecules, the DNA and RNA, it follows that the best or most causally adequate explanation is that it arose by virtue of an intelligent agency. One paradox in origin of life studies is the so-called chicken and egg paradox, where the DNA encodes for proteins, but the proteins are necessary to allow the DNA to replicate, because there's proteins that are involved, such as the DNA polymerase and so on, the helicase, which allow the DNA to replicate. And that this is the motivation that drives origin of life researchers to postulate an RNA first hypothesis, the idea that RNA in fact was the first genetic material, because RNA in fact has the ability to partially self-replicate. However, the ribozyme engineering experiments actually haven't shown that RNA can fully self-replicate, and the ribozyme engineering experiments actually demonstrate, I think, the requisite or the need for intelligent design in sequencing the RNA polymers. And also, RNA in the prebiotic environment is extremely unstable. It's single-stranded, unlike DNA, which is double-stranded. And also it has an extra 2' hydroxyl group, which basically causes it to be more chemically unstable. And so it seems unlikely that RNA could have survived in the early prebiotic environment. Another thing that needs to be explained when we're dealing with the origins of proteins in the origin of life, we first need to explain, the homochirality of the amino acids that form the proteins involved in life. All of our proteins have what's called a left-handed isomeric, or the left-handed isomer of.
Jonathan, hold on one second. That's a good topic. We're going to need to take a break.
Okay.
But when we come back to that, I have heard Bill Gates make a claim that DNA is computer code, basically, but better than any computer code we've ever written. So your argument that information comes from an intelligence is an excellent one. What do you think? Now, you were given the RNA first idea. When we come back, if you could tell us, what do you think is what's the leading explanation that naturalists give for trying to explain this information, and what are the problems with it? And then we'll start with something with Jean first, and then I want you to jump to that. But first, a break.
Did you know that ABN has been on air for 10 years and started broadcasting to North America through the Galaxy 19 satellite? Now ABN and Trinity Channel programs are being aired to 4 continents through 3 different satellites. These satellites cover North America, Mexico, Central America and the Caribbean, Australia, New Zealand, North Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. One of these satellites is Nilesat, the most popular satellite in the Middle East. Though the coverages are great and our passion is to spread the word of God to as many countries as possible in 4 different languages, this mission definitely has a big cost in our airtime. We are here to ask for your prayers and your support in bringing the truth from the word of God to the whole world and to set people free. You can support ABN in 4 different ways. Please visit our website at trinitychannel.com and click donate. You can go through the ABN apps, or you can send your check to the P.O. box listed below, or you can call the numbers at your screen. Trinity Channel is now publicly streaming on Roku. There is no need for a code anymore, and through Roku, you can watch us 24/7 on your TV. You can find us through 2 ways on Roku. The first way is through the streaming channel category. The second way is by searching for Trinity Channel in your search bar. For more information, please call the numbers at your screen.
Thank you so much for watching the Trinity Channel. We are now airing in 8 states in the US. You can watch us through our YouTube channels at ABN English, Trinity Channel, or our website at trinitychannel.com. Be sure to look out for our live shows, which you can find when they are airing through our Facebook page or trinitychannel.com. We are only able to continue reaching the lost and spreading the message of Christ through your support and prayers. If you would like to support us or need prayer, please call us at 248-416-1300, or you can go to our website at trinitychannel.com. Together, we can spread God's love to the lost and hurting throughout the world.
Welcome back. Jean, I want to get to you a question about patterns you see in biology, but first, I like that you brought up doubts that you had. I think a lot of people think there's something wrong with them when they have doubts, but everyone has doubts in every belief system. That's a natural thing, and it only becomes a problem when you just kind of try to ignore them when they're really kind of seriously getting to you. How did you handle when you had those doubts? So you said you did see some things that really kind of made you think, wow, this kind of beauty and complexity is from God, but how did you handle it? Because that can be really straining.
I think I ran into more.
Had a freeze? Okay. Is Jonathan still available? Okay, Jonathan, but while we're waiting to get Jean back, so what do you think So coming up with information, we only know of intelligent agents that create information. What do you think is their best hope or best attempt at explaining information, and what pluses and minuses and problems or benefits are with that argument?
To be quite frank, all origin of life models do not explain the origins of information or even really make any serious attempt to. Origin of life models try to explain different elements of what needs to be explained in the origin of life, but however, none has come even close to explaining the origins of biological information. You've got so many problems which compound together to form insurmountable challenges to materialistic scenarios for the origins of life. You not only have to explain the origins of the genetic code, the nucleotide to amino acid mapping, or the codon to amino acid mapping. Codons are the triplets of bases which specify amino acids. There are 64 different codons or 3-character words, each of which specifies an amino acid. There's 20 different amino acids used in life. And as I alluded to earlier, there's also the problem of getting the homochirality, because there's 2 different isomeric forms of amino acids. There's left-handed amino acids and right-handed amino acids. When you produce amino acids in a lab setting, for example, the Stanley Miller and Harold Urey experiment in 1953, you produce what's called a racemic mixture, which is a 50-50 mixture of left and right-handed isomeric forms. The problem, though, is that life only has one isomeric form. And so how do you select for the right isomeric form? But even supposing that you could surmount that difficulty, you got to explain the origins of the biological information. You've got to explain how these amino acids, having amino acids isn't going to give you proteins that do any jobs within the cell and perform complex chemistry, like performing enzyme catalysis or forming parts or components of molecular machines and so forth. So you need the amino acids to be sequenced in a particular way in order to form structures. And of course, many proteins involved in biology, for a protein to even fold, it requires a minimum length. And so it's not simply enough to have short polypeptides, which then could evolve into larger, more complex proteins. You need a minimum length of your polypeptide chain before it will even fold properly into a 3-dimensional structure.
Right. And that 3-dimensional structure determines how it acts, what its function is. Is that correct?
Exactly.
All right. One thing that I had thought, I want you to correct me on it if I was wrong, because it just kind of strikes me every time I hear. So I heard of a group that they presented at an international Origin of Life meeting. I think Fuzz Rana had spoken about this, where they had said, well, maybe you can get all a certain type of chirality if you have clay, and we've done this in the lab, and they all kind of lined up, and we've created a certain level of structure. But my problem with that was, and I think it was addressed by others, including Fuzz, was you have some of the brightest minds we have in science. You have all this billions of or millions of dollars worth in that project. You have a decade's worth of work. You have lab instructions. The lab instructions to follow correctly would be to the ceiling. And then you have perfect lab and lab conditions. What that seems is, and then you're only producing a part of the information that would be needed, or a part of the structure that's needed. Well, whatever led to the origin of life must be vastly better funded, more intelligent than those scientists, because it actually achieved it. Now, am I being too flippant with that, or is that a valid way to look?
Yeah, for sure. When your origin of life models, as I mentioned, tend to try to address one small part of the problem, and you require a large array of different ideas in order to tackle different parts of the problem, and certainly all origin of life models fall short of the hurdle of explaining the origins of biological information. So there's a lot of things that need to be explained, not least of which is the origins of information. And so explaining, you don't just require, even getting homochirality, you still need to explain how the proteins, how the amino acids align correctly in order to form a protein that folds within the cell. I mean, there's been some work done on the relative ratio of functional to non-functional sequences of amino acids within combinatorial space. So if you take, for example, a melodically length protein or a polypeptide chain of 150 amino acids, well, we know there's 20 different types of amino acids. So there's 20 to the 150th power of possible ways of arranging those amino acids. And so,
just to let me give one thing to the audience, here's a very coarse description. So the way these amino acids fold together to get a three-dimensional shape, let's say like this, by its specific shape determines how it interacts with the other chemistry in you and determines its function. And what Jonathan was saying is this shape is one but of multitude that it could have taken, and those multitude of others wouldn't function the way we need it to. Is that a decent summary?
Yeah, I guess.
Although, of course,
there's different levels of structure for proteins. So the primary structure is the sequential arrangement of amino acids, and that will then determine how a protein folds. You have the secondary level of structure, which are alpha helices and beta strands together form beta sheets. And then those units of structure come together to form domains of proteins, which then come together to form the quaternary structure, where you have a multi-domained protein. And I mean, some of the work that's been done has been fascinating. For example, Doug Axe, who's a molecular biologist, has done a lot of really fascinating work on how difficult it is to produce folding protein structure that actually does a job in the cells. So, for example, in 2004, he published a paper in Journal of Molecular Biology where he basically took a particular domain from an enzyme complex involved in conferring antibiotic resistance to certain bacteria called beta-lactamase. And what he did was he conducted what's called a site-directed mutagenesis experiment. And he basically randomly altered the amino acid composition of this protein domain in order to elucidate the ratio of functional to non-functional folds. Right. And he, according to his work, the ratio of functional to non-functional folds within that vast array of combinatorial possibilities is 1 in 10 to the 74th power. So that's 1 over 10 with, or 1 over 1 with 74 zeros after it. So that's the level that we're talking about. So that's, and when you compound that with the problem of getting homochirality and all the different other problems involved in the origins of life, the probability of attaining the origin of life by stochastic means seems to be immensely small.
Right. And you've mentioned this a few times. So you're saying the different problems that are coming up, you're getting these diverging theories trying to address the different problems, but you're not seeing a convergence towards a single natural explanation.
Right, that you have to invoke really contrived and ad hoc hypotheses to explain different elements of what needs to be explained in the origin of life, and they all are real stretches. However, something like design is actually a parsimonious explanation because it explains everything with one explanation, and the one thing that all origin of life models just fail miserably at is explaining the origins of biological information, which just so happens to be the one thing that we uniformly associate with intelligent design.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great end statement there, Jean. So before we lost the connection, how did you handle those doubts when they came? Because it's a stressful thing. A lot of people think that it's not, there's something wrong with my faith or something like that. I don't think that. I think it's natural. But how did you handle it?
More of the evolutionary stuff. I believed, I was a Christian, and I believed that God existed. And at one point, the doubts were really strong. And I felt like I was going to be stupid if I obeyed God. And I think I had to apologize or something. That was very difficult for me to do. And I felt like there was a voice that said I was being stupid and foolish because there was no God. But I thought about it and said, no, if God exists, I want to please him. So even though during this brief point in time, I'm not sure, I am going to behave as if he does exist, and I'm going to do this very difficult thing and be obedient, just in case, because if he does exist, I want to please him. Yeah. And I think God will often challenge us to be obedient like that, and then he will give us answers. The second thing I did is where there were questions, I dug deeper. And so I learned to dig into the scientific literature, and I do that all the time now. I dig into lots of articles written by evolutionists. I look and see what is the evidence, and I see that they put their own interpretation on it. So the idea that all life just came from a single common ancestor, That's their interpretation. And they take the data and they try to shove it in that mold. Sometimes it doesn't go in very well. A lot of times it doesn't.
That's a good point. So there's data and then there's interpretation of data that are separate.
And it took me a long time to really see the difference. It takes a while.
All right. Speaking of data, what patterns do you see in biology that show to you that life was created by the God of the Bible?
Okay, there's a couple of things.
Or by an intelligent agent, God of the Bible or intelligent agent at this point.
Well, let's start with the God of the Bible.
All right.
If you look at Genesis chapter 1, it said that plants and animals were created according to their kinds. And he told the animals to reproduce and fill the earth. If you look at Isaiah, there's a verse in there that says that God desired for the earth to be inhabited. And so from a very simple frame of reference, I can see foxes that exist in the desert. There's foxes that exist in the Arctic. And there's foxes that exist all over the world. And the same is true of rabbits. The same is true of finches. And so I see a pattern in nature where, sure enough, animals have reproduced and filled the earth. And the plants have as well. And it tells me several other things. You aren't, just as you aren't going to get an animal to come into existence by chance, you aren't going to get it to be able to adapt to a new environment by chance. If you look at the underlying physiology, for me to even go visit a family member who lives in Quito, Ecuador, where there's a very high altitude, there's an amazing amount of things that have to go on so I can breathe in that very thin air that doesn't have a lot of oxygen. And it's astounding what we have learned goes on physiologically in our bodies just to be able to cope to a simple change like a change in altitude. And there's other changes that we deal with. Well, the changes are very well controlled and they don't happen by accident. And there's some changes are like within my lifetime type changes, and other changes we can see that take course over multiple lifetimes because the animals in the Arctic are different from those in the desert.
Yeah.
So there's some genetic changes, there's epigenetic changes, which means you aren't changing the actual DNA sequence, you're just changing when you read that gene and how much of the product comes out.
Okay.
And then there's other changes that are genetic, and in both cases they can be adaptive.
Well, Jonathan, what speaking of those like the kinds, or what do you think best explains the origin of the animal body plans?
Sure. Well, the animal body plans, or the phyla, to use the technical term, they basically the vast majority of them arose during a period in life's history known as the Cambrian period, at a point known as the Cambrian Explosion, which most geologists would date to approximately 530 million years ago. And within a very narrow window of geological time, 5 to 10 million years, the vast majority of the animal body plans emerge very abruptly, which isn't what you would expect on a neo-Darwinian model. On a Darwinian model, you would expect the major differences, or the disparity, the morphological disparity, if you will, to appear only after numerous small-scale speciation events, where you'd have these numerous small-scale speciation events leading up to the big differences in form, or the disparity, the morphological disparity, if you will. Whereas what we actually see is the reverse of that, where we have in the Cambrian period morphological disparity, all the major body plans, and then after that you see minor differences in those themes over time, the lower taxonomic categories. But the major differences appear right at the start. Now, there are Charles Darwin, of course, was aware of the Cambrian fossil record, although it wasn't called the Cambrian back then; it was called the Silurian. And he was aware that the Cambrian fossil record posed a problem or a challenge to his theory. He hoped that subsequent fossil hunting would dig up the fossils that were the predecessors to the Cambrian fauna, and indeed, 150 years later, we have found some Precambrian organisms, but they are not predecessors to the animals we find during the Cambrian, which is interesting. And what's even more fascinating is that many of these are small and soft-bodied. We even have, for example, in the Precambrian strata, preserved sponge embryos, which are and very difficult to, one of the common rejoinders to the argument from the Cambrian explosion is that the animals that preceded the Cambrian fauna were just too small and too soft-bodied to be preserved. Why is it then that we find these soft-bodied organisms and small soft-bodied organisms which aren't predecessors to the Cambrian? If the Cambrian fossil record is such that it can preserve those, why can't it preserve the immediate predecessors to the Cambrian fauna?
That's a good answer.
And what is required biologically to explain the origins of body plan? Remember that you need to explain a developmental pathway. You need to explain how you go from a fertilized egg or a zygote to a viable body plan, and that requires traversing a distance of non-viable intermediates, right? You have to go from the zygote all the way through development to your viable organism. And Paul Nelson, who's a philosopher of biology, has coined the term ontogenetic death to describe that distance between the zygote and the viable organism. It's not enough to stop halfway or 3/4 of the way through that developmental program. You have to get all the way over in order to have a viable phenotype.
Yeah.
And so that is a significant difficulty, I think, in explaining the origins of body plans. It also seems, incidentally, that to change one body plan into another, you require perturbations to early development, because that's when the body plan is established. But that's precisely the point at which perturbations are very or uniformly deleterious and often and normally, in fact, lethal.
Jean, if you could follow with, so we went to animal body plans. What evidence is there that humans were created separately from other animals?
There's a number of traits we have that are very distinct from other animals. And at a very obvious level, our ability for language is very different from animal ability in language. Yes, you can get some birds that can say words and put things together in a very simple manner. Right. But we have the ability to explain very abstract ideas in very powerful ways that nothing in the animal kingdom has. Well, let's go to genetics. If we are physically different and we are in our mental abilities different from other animals, you'd expect that to come out in the genetic level as well, and it does. In fact, there's these regions in the human body that are very different from other animals. And these regions that, if you're an evolutionist, you have to assume that it evolved. So they're called human accelerated regions because the evolutionary explanation is they evolved very rapidly in humans. They've been the same for years in all of the animal kingdom, but now they've suddenly developed very rapidly. And they don't fit well with the pattern of evolution. I wrote a few things down here so I could share with you. All right. In one of them, if you try to see what's the closest, the chicken is closest to the elephant and the human's closest to the mouse. They compared about 10 different species. In a different one, the human's closest to the elephant, the chicken's closest to the dog, and the rhesus monkey is closest to the mouse. Now, they compared 4 primates, a monkey, a gorilla, a chimpanzee, and monkey, gorilla, chimpanzee, and orangutan. Why aren't humans closest to the primates? That it doesn't work. And we have in the Creation Research Society quarterly, this research is going to come out in our spring edition. You find that there are many times where if you compare genes and try to make a family tree like evolutionists do, and you can assume everything's related, a lot of times it doesn't fit that idea well. Well, you're not told that in your high school textbook. You're not even told that in your college textbook. You have to dig into the literature, and you find that the story that people get in public is very different than what the evidence actually looks like.
Yeah,
and that's very common because they're trying to promote their worldview and they only understand it within their worldview. Stuff that doesn't fit doesn't make sense, so they don't talk about it at the lay level.
All right, well, so you both presented evidence now that, or things that would be better explained by an intelligent agent as opposed to just nature and natural laws. What are some of the standard objections to have a personal agent, an intelligent designer, a personal agent? What are some objections that you ran into? And what answers would you provide for them? Just something that comes off the top of your head. If not, I can go to the next thing. But Jonathan, how about yourself?
Sure. One common objection to intelligent design is that it is a God of the gaps argument. And by God of the gaps, I mean the idea that intelligent design is basically rendered a placeholder for that which we are ignorant of. We can't explain feature X, and so we plug in God or an intelligent designer to explain it. And so as a scientist advances, the argument actually has to shrink with each new advance in scientific discovery. So that's the God of the gaps argument.
Yeah.
Intelligent design, however, really doesn't work like that. It's based on the standard principles of scientific investigation with respect to the past, known as the historical abductive method, or the inference to the best explanation from multiple competing hypotheses. And basically, when we find information in any realm of experience, we immediately infer that it's the product of agency or mind. So when we find it intrinsic to the hereditary molecules of DNA and RNA, we infer that the best explanation for that is that it too arose by virtue of intelligent agency. Just as you might, if you're on an island and you find volcanic ash, you might favor the volcanic eruption hypothesis over the flood and earthquake hypothesis by virtue of the fact that volcanic eruptions are known to produce the effect in question, whereas floods and earthquakes are not. And so that is the argument. So actually a positive argument based upon what we do know rather than what we don't know. Another objection is that intelligent design isn't science, and there's a number of reasons that people try to argue this. Some say that it violates methodological naturalism. But in fact, I would argue that intelligent agency is in fact a natural phenomenon. It's not a material phenomenon, but it's certainly natural. Intelligence is a natural phenomenon that we have experience of, and so I don't necessarily think that intelligent design simpliciter violates methodological naturalism. Some people also argue that intelligent design is not falsifiable, and so it's not science. Has been unanimously abandoned by contemporary philosophers of science because it's simply not a good criterion of demarcation between science and non-science. For example, scientific paradigms today are generally falsified not by a single piece of anomalous data, but by numerous, by a numerous network of data which seems to be inconsistent with the theory, eventually overhauls the theory.
Yeah, a cumulative case.
Exactly. And intelligent design is also charged sometimes with not making testable predictions, but intelligent design actually predicts that when we look at life, when we look at the cell, we'll find specified complexity, which is the hallmark of intelligent agency, where you find not only something which is immensely complex, and by complex I mean improbable, but also conforms to some independently given pattern, so it's specified in that way. We predict that we'll find that when we look at the cell.
Yeah.
Or that, intelligent design has no heuristic value, it's a sign stopper, but intelligent design actually motivates and encourages us to look for functions for example, so-called junk DNA or apparently suboptimal design, which often turns out to be not so suboptimally designed. Or we're told intelligent design isn't science because it invokes unobservable entities, but then particle physics and other disciplines also invoke unobservable entities. Or that intelligent design doesn't address the modus operandi of design, doesn't tell us how the design came to be implemented, but we still don't understand even how mind interacts with the material world. And so simply the fact that we don't have an independent theory for how the design was implemented or instantiated in nature doesn't mean that we can't infer design as the best explanation. An astronaut who finds a pile of machinery or even a hieroglyphic inscription on the backside of the moon is justified in inferring agency, even if he has no idea how it came to be there.
Right.
So these are some of the objections that we commonly encounter.
Yeah, you gave about 10 objections, and like William Lane Craig said in one of these debates, he's like, 10 bad objections don't even add up to one good one. Dr. Lightner, how about yourself? Have you run into just some specific objections you might be able to give to the audience, partly to see that naturalism has come back with some responses, but then also what would your response be to that? Is there one that jumped to your mind?
Well, what I find is if I try to have a scientific discussion with someone, they'll usually change the topic. They don't
I found that too.
Stay on science.
Yeah.
You find that both the evolutionary story and the Bible give a history of what happened, a narrative about how life came to be. And they're stories that are at odds with each other. And so the most common thing is just for people to assume that the Bible's not true and everything has to be interpreted through universal common ancestry. And so they just assume your view out. Say, oh, that's not possible. And they never really address things. That's what I find most commonly.
Yeah, and that's psychology. Beliefs aren't just based on intellect. There's emotion, volition, there's costs involved. So there's a lot of things. So that makes sense what you say. And I think all of us experienced that to some extent. Next one, for both of you, just we can start with Jonathan, I guess, and go to Jean if we want to keep going in the order. Basically just kind of coming to well, first I want to do this before I go to kind of a general summary. Are there other points that I haven't got to yet? Biology is in my area. So is there another point that you would like to make that you think is a very strong thing to consider when you're considering, do we have personal agency involved or not? What would you like to add in that I haven't got to yet? We'll start with Jonathan, and then we'll go to Dr. Lightner.
Sure. I mean, there is plenty of things that could be discussed. There's so many that one hardly knows where to start. I mean, you could talk for hours about this, but let me just give one other additional argument since you invited me. One problem, I think, with the evolutionary story is that even aside from the probabilistic hurdles in explaining the major or complex adaptations that are required for natural selection to select for the origins of protein structures, the origin of macromolecular machines, and so on. Even beyond that, there's the problem of the fact that much of the information necessary for driving the morphogenesis of organismal form actually exists beyond the purview of the DNA molecule. Yeah. And so you can actually mutate DNA indefinitely without respect to time or number of trials or probabilistic resources, and you will never ultimately be able to generate the kind of form and structure you need to build a new fundamentally kind of organism. So, for example, there's the spatial distribution of ion channels in the cell membrane, and of course ion channels are themselves encoded by the DNA, but their spatial distribution is not. And so these ion channels can actually establish an electromagnetic field which can influence the form of a developing organism. And there's also the sugar code, which is another source of epigenetic information. Epigenetic is information beyond the DNA sequence itself. And that affects embryological development, there's a source of such epigenetic information in the form of sugar molecules, the arrangement of sugar molecules on the exterior surface of the cell's membrane. And these sugars can actually attach to the membrane's lipid molecules to form glycolipids, and the cell surface patterns that emerge as a result are extremely complex, and they thus have a high level of information storage capacity. And the ability of these structures to influence the arrangement of cell types during embryogenesis or development has led to it being referred to as the sugar code. And so that adds an additional layer to the information necessary to drive the morphogenesis of organismal form. And so if it is indeed true that much of the information necessary for the development of a body plan exists beyond DNA, then you can't use neo-Darwinian mechanisms to generate a new body plan. It's simply the wrong tool for the job to use DNA.
Huh. Wrong tool for the job. That's a good phrase for that. Dr. Lightner, how about yourself? Is there something else that just kind of comes to your mind that you would like me to ask you about?
Yes, the word evolution is very interesting because sometimes it can refer to change over time, and sometimes it refers to the idea that all animal life and plant life are related by common ancestry. Well, I mentioned that God enabled his creatures to adapt to different environments. And the interesting thing is, if you look at it genetically, you find that in order to adapt, you have to have a tremendously complex design and networks. And you have to have design in there that allows for changes. You know, you could have a design that doesn't allow for changes, but your design must allow for changes. And we find that there is fine tuning that goes on for genetic adaptations, and there's times where things are broken. And I'll give you one example. In a lot of creatures, there's animals that are completely black. And you think, wow, something new. There's been a change. Well, there has, but God designed most creatures to be able to make two different forms of pigment. A very dark pigment that's essentially black, and a lighter pigment that tends to be yellowish or reddish. And most animals can produce both. Well, how do you get a black animal? In many cases, all you do is there's a certain protein on the pigment cell, and you break it. You actually break it so it's stuck in an on position, because it works like a switch. It'll switch between the two different colors. And you keep it stuck on all the time. Now it no longer responds to the normal signals, and the animal will produce a black pigment. Well, what did you do? You took something that was already complex and already there, and you adjusted it. You adjusted in a way that really broke it, sort of, you know. And you can have beautiful animals. In fact, your light-colored animals are often because you broke it, and it's now off all the time, and now you only get the lighter pigment. So we find in many adaptations, you've taken something complex and you've essentially broken it. You've made it so it no longer responds to signaling molecules. So it no longer works in the way you would ordinarily expect. And this is going the wrong direction. This is not your onward, upward change. This is change because a designer put enough in there to allow for adaptive changes, but it's not going to get you where you need to go if you want to believe everything's related.
Yeah, all right. Put the design in there knowing that environments are going to change, knowing that there's going to be this need to adapt. So basically forward planning.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Jonathan, molecular machines. Could you give us an example and show how that fits in with the argument?
Sure. There's plenty of examples that could be given. One example, which has become kind of a flagship example for intelligent design, is the so-called bacterial flagellar motor, which is an outboard rotary motor which propels many bacteria through liquid. And the bacterial flagellum was made famous by Michael Behe in his 1996 publication, Darwin's Black Box, where he argued for a concept known as irreducible complexity, the idea that that you can have certain systems, macromolecular machines, are performing jobs within the cell, and these macromolecular machines are contributed by a cohort of subfunctions or components performing subfunctions. And the removal of one of those components or the removal of one of those subfunctions that needs to be performed results in the overall system losing its function. And so the idea is, how would you build one of these systems by virtue of numerous slight successive variations? Charles Darwin, of course, in his 1859 publication on the origin of species, said if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And so, in other words, you know, if you could demonstrate that there was a certain system in biology which couldn't be built in that way, then that would serve as a falsification for Darwin's mechanism of selection and variation. And the bacterial flagellum seems to be one such system. There are plenty of other such systems in biology. The bacterial flagellar motor is very diverse across bacterial species. It contains many of the components you might expect to find in a typical man-made motor, such as a hook structure and a propeller, and it has bushings and bearings and so on. It has a motor. It's driven by the flow of hydrogen ions, or it's remarkable.
So specific components themselves are even very comparable. I mean, you talk about bushings and...
Yeah. You can look at some of the electron micrographs, and the resemblance to a typical man-made motor is eerie. It's incredible. And these things are way beyond human technology, because these outboard rotary motors have an energy conversion efficiency of virtually 100%. And in Salmonella, which is the model system for studying assembly, or Escherichia coli, which is very similar, it spins at speeds of up to 18,000 rotations per minute, or RPM. In Vibrio cholera, it can spin at speeds of up to 100,000 RPM. So these things are incredibly efficient and incredibly powerful systems found in nature. And in fact, they are incredible because they actually assemble themselves, they build themselves within the cell. And they're plugged into a remarkable chemotactic system, which is basically a signal transduction apparatus, so that it's getting feedback from the environment and is able to adjust its course in response to chemical stimuli or repellents. But the assembly apparatus itself is absolutely remarkable. And just to put together the different components in the right order, the right temporal order, is a feat of engineering prowess. And one common objection that has been put forward to the argument from irreducible complexity is the idea of exaptation or co-option. For example, Ken Miller at Brown University popularized this idea that the bacterial flagellum, for example, uses a type 3 export apparatus, which is basically a syringe that it uses to export flagellar proteins during assembly. And the type 3 secretion system can also be used in bacteria to inject poisons into multicellular organisms. And so he argues, well, it's clearly not irreducibly complex because you remove 30 of the 40 components and you're left with a type 3 secretion system. There's some problems with this objection, however. For example, there's some good evidence that the type 3 secretion system actually is an evolutionary degradation product or byproduct of the flagellar system, and actually the flagellum predates the type 3 secretion system. So the type 3 secretion system, for example, is taxonomically restricted to a small subset of gram-negative bacteria. Gram-negative bacteria, of course, have two membranes, an inner membrane and outer membrane, whereas the flagella are much more widely distributed across not only gram-negative but also gram-positive bacteria. Gram-positive bacteria have just a single membrane. And also it makes evolutionary sense because the selection for motility precedes the selection for virulence. You need to be able to swim before you need to be able to inject poisons into multicellular organisms. And also many of the bacteria that...
I gotcha. So there's a couple things. You'd need to swim before you'd need to be able to inject. So this idea that the injector of poison system came before doesn't work because of that. And also, you had noted that injector of poison system actually was a degradation. So you had the flagellum and it degraded to become that. So this wasn't the precursor that led to it. Did I get that right?
That seems to be the case. In fact, all the bacteria which possess a type 3 secretion system also possess the genes for making flagella, even if no flagella are assembled. For example, Yersinia pestis, which is the cause of bubonic plague, which is a bacterium which possesses a type 3 secretion system but has no flagella, but has the genes for making flagella. So that again suggests that the type 3 secretion system came later than the flagellum.
Oh, that's really interesting. I hadn't heard any of that part of it. If my friends in the studio could get that last PowerPoint slide up, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to do a wrap-up, the start of a wrap-up, and talk about there is 4 possible causes of the universe that are given that have been given in scientific and philosophical literature. If I've happened to miss one, you can feel free to add it in, but these 4 general areas are all that I've been able to come across, and I've even got this information from another. So if you could advance it to the next slide, should be the next one. So out of the 4 possible causes, one of them, which you'll see on the right-hand side at the top, are natural causes. The idea that there's something in the natural universe is the cause of the universe. Now, that option has already been eliminated. For those who believe in naturalism, that nature and natural laws can explain all that there is, there's a big problem with that. You can't have a natural cause to the universe because nature itself was what was created. As John Lennox has noted, saying X creates Y, that's what we see. Saying X creates X, that's nonsense. It would be like Frank Turek brings up, he always said, if you believe that the universe, something in the universe could go back and before it existed, create itself and everything else, that'd be like believing you gave birth to your parents. It just doesn't make sense. So we already know that nature is not the cause of the universe. Now, when you're talking nature, here are some of the causes that are included in that. A quantum vacuum. What they say is, well, the universe emerged out of a quantum vacuum. But the problem is, a vacuum is part of space. It's not nothing. A vacuum is just like, you picture the most emptiest part of space where you're not seeing any matter in there. But that vacuum is still part of the space-time continuum that was created. So it cannot be it's part of what was created, that nature. So natural causes are out. They're not an option. They have a fatal flaw there. So I was in a debate at U of M, and after this, the person I was debating, after he saw that naturalism didn't work, I think he had tried to go on to maybe a hypernatural cause. Now, he didn't want to call it supernatural. He didn't like the connotations to it. So a hypernatural cause, meaning, okay, if all of nature was created here, then whatever created it is outside of our normal nature, but maybe it's a different type of nature. So it's supernatural or hypernatural. Now, there's a couple problems with that. Now, multiple universes would be an example of that. There's a theory that our universe is here, but it was created by a bigger universe before. Now, the problem with that is there's a couple problems. First of all they did is push it back a step. Our universe, because it had a beginning, everything that begins to exist has a cause. So our universe now requires a cause. Even if there was a multiverse, there was studies done by 3 leading cosmologists, Bohr, Guth, and Vilenkin. And what they found is they spent 10 years and 5 papers trying to prove that, well, we don't really need a beginning to the universe. All they did was tighten the grip of that and showed that even a multiverse, basically any possible universe that expands on average, must have a beginning. So even if our universe was created by a supernatural multiverse, that multiverse still requires a beginning, still requires a cause. And because it would still have one characteristic the same with our nature. Nature, one thing we know about nature is it's ceaselessly changing. Now, some things might take a really long time to happen, or at least for us to measure it, but nature ceaselessly changes and eventually runs out of its usable energy. So if our universe, or even a multiverse, had existed forever, then by now all that, that usable energy would be used up and we wouldn't have any stars shining. So if you look up and see stars shining, that's already evidence that we don't have a natural cause or even a multiverse as a cause. A second problem is, some would say that, well, maybe you could have a multiverse that was also outside of time. Now, the problem with that, though, is I'm a physicist, and every equation that we work with has time built in there. So if you have n sub t equals n naught e raised to the negative lambda t, that's a radioactive decay equation. That t is time. Time is always involved in the equations because if you make time 0, nothing can happen. So whatever you started with is just not going to change at all. So even if there was this supernatural matter, and even if it was outside time, it's still going to suffer from the fact that it could not change. So we would never bring this universe into existence like we did. You need something that can also have a choice. So supernatural matter, that second option, which includes things like multiple universes, this is also not really a potential cause. The final 2 are, and you can see them on the bottom, either an immaterial mind, a mind that is not made of material things, or an abstract object. Now, abstract objects have come into play because they said, well, for example, Stephen Hawking, he said, well, it could be natural laws, such as the law, there's a quantum gravity law that actually created our universe. There's a problem with that, though. Laws describe how things behave. They don't actually create things. I could give you the equation for the force of gravity. Between you and anything else that has mass, there's gravity. There's a gravity force between me and this computer that I could calculate. The force of that gravity would equal a gravitational constant times the 2 masses divided by the distance between us squared. Now, if you are starting with nothing before the universe came into existence, that law or that equation that gives you the force, the masses, we don't exist yet, so we go to zero, so that force would be zero. A natural law cannot do anything. In fact, abstract objects, by definition, do not cause anything. John Lennox, a mathematician at Oxford, he had said, because some people were trying to say, well, it's maybe numbers, maybe some mathematical abstract object can cause things. But he made the point, the laws of arithmetic never added anything to my bank account. They're useful for us to describe things, but natural laws, abstract objects, they don't have causative power. Which only leads us, with out of the 4 general possibilities that have been given through time in science or philosophical literature, we end up with the immaterial mind as the one so far that does not have a very serious flaw. Not only does it not have the flaw, but when we were talking about what's the cause, was it a family of bears, a thief, or the wind that caused that ransacking of that house? Whatever theory you come up with, you judge it by the same tests of truth they use in all fields of study. What has the best explanatory power? Which has the best explanatory scope? What has the best predictive ability? Jonathan mentioned some predictive ability with some of the theories coming out of Discovery Institute. I mentioned some predictability of the Bible, predicting the properties of the cause in the beginning of the universe. Testability is another one. There's also, you got to look at the cumulative case. Out of all the evidence from all the fields, what are they pointing to? There's also going to be trends of evidence, and also you want to avoid lack of, you don't want to have like ad hoc and other logical errors in your thinking, in your model. And what we find is, and this is going to be up to you to be the jury. Now, we covered a lot of things, and we're coming from our perspective. You can look at what other people's perspectives are. But out of the possible causes here, which ones fit the best explanatory power, scope, lack of ad hoc, testability, comprehensive case, and so on? And my bet, which I'm basing our life we're basing on our worldview foundations. That's where we make our choices, actions, responses, goals, priorities. I'm basing mine on that immaterial mind because I think that has the best explanation of the evidence that we have. Now, Jonathan and Jean, I'd like you to, is there any other kind of summary things that you would like to add in? We have about 6 minutes left, so I'll give 3 to Jonathan, and then we can go with 3 to Jean, and then we'll close up.
Sure,
Jonathan?
I think you did a great job of summarizing the cosmological arguments for God's existence. Of course, there's 2 main different versions or variations of the cosmological argument. Right. There's the Kalam argument, which is to say that everything which begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause, and we can say certain things about this cause. It must be transtemporal, spaceless, and immaterial. Yep. And indeed immensely intelligent, and we get that from the finely tuned parameters of the initial constants, of physics, initial parameters of the universe, and so on, suggest it must be intelligent. And also, I would argue, must be personal, because the only way that you can have a necessary changeless cause have a contingent temporal effect is to have free will, because if you have an eternal set of changeless, necessary, and sufficient conditions, the effect is necessarily there. Yes. So the only way that you can actually have a contingent effect is if the cause is personal, and by personal I mean have free will, which is attributes traditionally associated with God. And the Leibnizian version of the cosmological argument basically observes that our universe is contingent, and our universe doesn't have to be here. It's governed by physical laws which are contingent, and so the ultimate unmoved mover of our universe must be something which is necessary. And so that's the argument there. Now, you've presented some scientific arguments, some very good scientific arguments for why the universe we know began to exist. There's also some good persuasive philosophical arguments for why we know that our universe began to exist. You can't traverse, for example, an infinite distance. You can't traverse an infinite amount of time. For example, imagine that you have 2 teams who are playing a tug of war, and each team has an infinite number of people on each side. And imagine that half of one of the teams dies of a heart attack spontaneously. then the rope remains tense, right? Because you still have an infinite number of people on each side. But we know that's ridiculous. We know that's absurd. Likewise, if you have an infinite number of numbers and you were to subtract all the even numbers, you still have an infinite number of numbers. Whereas if you were to subtract all the numbers that were 3 or greater, you have just 2 numbers left. And so you have, from 1 to infinity, that you just have numbers 1 and 2, so you just have 2 numbers left. So that leads to a mathematical contradiction. Infinity minus infinity equals infinity, and infinity minus infinity equals 2. So there's some real problems philosophically and scientifically with the idea that we live in an eternal universe. And finally, if I might say, I think that there's good reason to take our universe to be created by a being who is not only who actually takes an interest in human affairs and is actually and actually creates what we might call a moral arena. Now, a moral arena, of course, is a community of embodied agents that behave in morally significant ways, and we live in a moral arena. And a moral arena is something which you would expect on theism. It's something that is to be expected on theism. People might put different percentages on the expectation. Some people might say that it's 50-50. God might, he might not create a moral arena. Some people might say it's 20% likelihood that God would create a moral arena. You might even say it's 1%, but it's not going to be something astronomically small. It's going to be somewhere probably within the ballpark of 1 to 100%. Now, on atheism, however, what is the probability that you would get a moral arena? Well, what do you need? You need a universe governed by physical laws such as gravity. You need a finely tuned universe, and of course, we didn't really touch much on actually fine tuning of our universe. There's many constants and values which are finely tuned for life. Just to take one quick example, Roger Penrose.
Yeah, real quick, because we're
okay.
Short.
Okay, sure. Very quickly then. Roger Penrose, for example, University of Oxford, has calculated that most configurations of matter in the early universe would have resulted in a universe predominated by black holes. And so the initial low entropy conditions of our universe, according to Penrose, are finely tuned to 1 part in 10 raised to the 10 raised to the 123rd power. So if you were to write down all the zeros after the 1 in the denominator, you'd run out of elementary particles before you run out of zeros. So that's the level of fine tuning. But basically,
beyond imagination. That number's beyond imagination, way more than there are elementary particles in the universe. And if there is an intelligence that took this much purpose in creating not only the universe, but then life, like you two have shown in the biology, did he then maybe express himself even more personally in what was done through Jesus? And that's part of that cumulative case also. And Dr. Lightner, could you give your last comments?
Yeah, you made a comment that in physics, we know that useful energy started at a very high point, and then there was this entropy that goes on. And I think genetically, you find the same thing. So both Jonathan and I gave examples of something that clearly started out complex, and changes have occurred that have eroded that. So there's this concept of genetic entropy, in fact, that things deteriorate over time, and you don't have things just boom appear with all this complex design. Things are going the wrong direction for the evolutionists.
Now that's a very good point. With just the last remaining time, there was just a couple other questions that actually that are kind of fit in but didn't get to. For example, who created God then? If God is this supernatural being that's outside of time and changeless then, but does have a choice. So Richard Dawkins brought this up. When presented with scientific evidence, this was the response was, well, then who created God if God's supposed to be this cause? But what he's doing is a logic error. It's a category error. God and the universe are in a different category. That the argument that Jonathan, the cosmological argument that Jonathan brought up, and actually I talked a little bit earlier, was everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. God, or whatever that first uncaused first cause is, did not begin to exist. That's an entirely different category. Not to mention, Dawkins was picturing God as something like a physical being that has all these interconnection, complicated body structure, but an immaterial mind is not built like that. So again, that was just based on a category error. One final thing is, a lot of people bring up the Christians have blind faith, as though it's a belief in something without reasons. But you know, faith has three parts. It has the object that you believe in, for example, a chair. It has the content, I believe this chair will hold me up, and it has the reasons why. I think it'll hold me up because it looks sturdy. I haven't been dropped in a while, and the people here seem to like me, so I don't think they're going to play a joke on me. The faith that the Christian has, and I think that you guys showed very well, there are reasons. This is a reasoned faith. It is a trust based on reasons. If a father's in a swimming pool asks us to jump in the deep end, we might be scared, but we don't jump in without any reasons at all. We do it because we know that father is trustworthy, can swim well, and has our best interests at heart. And I think today we showed also that the Christians have can have the same kind of trust in their father. I'm trying to keep track of the time. I think we're on our way out. Thank you so much, Jonathan and Jean. You guys have added so much to this. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and then for the rest of this Apologetics Marathon, I hope you tune in. There's so many diverse areas to study and to give you reasons for the hope that you have. Thank you.